because we know that with every news source, there's an agenda that's attached to it, whether it's right-leaning or left-leaning. So guess what? Present them all. Don't just present one side of it, present them all. And even those that are in between, pose the questions that Ernest is talking about and allow for students to come to their own conclusions about it. That's how you build criticality and agency within students.
Kwame, thank you so much for coming on today and letting us discuss with you your book that you have coming out. Anytime someone writes a book, I want to talk to them because I know how much work it is to get it done and to cross the finish line. Number one, I'm usually jealous that you, because I would love to write a book one day, but when I see you guys actually get across the finish line, it makes me feel like it could be done. And I just haven't done it yet. But your new book, Learning to Relearn, what is the big idea in the book and what did you learn while you were writing Learning to Relearn?
Well, first off, Chris, before I answer the question, man, it's great to be here. And I got to thank you and the whole Bright Team family for allowing me to even strengthen my writing muscle all those years writing those posts for y'all. So,
man, you've been a voice for a while.
I appreciate y'all. And if it wasn't for that, out there I would have been able to write this book that's over 300 pages long. Now, see, I got so excited, I forgot the question.
Well, no, it's just really like, I always feel like you learn something while you're writing. You don't know everything yet. So I was just wondering, like, what did you learn while you were writing Learning to Relearn?
So many things. I think the main thing is you can't please everybody. Given the subject matter of the book, given the fact that I'm talking about so many different identities from different historically marginalized communities, I recognize that they're not monolithic in their orientation. And as a result, there's a diversity in thought. There's a diversity in culture, diversity in the history and other aspects of who they are. So as I was writing the book, my intention is always to make sure that I am representing the different communities that I talk about in the most honorable and respectable manner. But it's hard to do it when everybody thinks differently and they're within the same community. So that was something that I had to embrace and realize that, you know what, no matter how hard you try to appease people and to be respectful, you're going to disappoint somebody and you have to just live with it and just say, hey, I'm going to do better. This is my current understanding of the histories and the stories of the folks I talk about. And my hope is that as time goes on, I grow in my knowledge and capacity and to write something that's going to better represent the people I talk about. So I think that was the main lesson I gathered from my writing process.
In the section that you do around being young, Black, and misunderstood, you talk about how your own experience with trauma impacted your teaching. I found that like a unique idea, or your philosophy, your teaching philosophy.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. How did your own kind of experience with trauma impact the way that you teach and want to develop young people now?
Yeah, so as I was going through those times as a kid, I learned how to be resilient. I learned that, hey, there are people out there who really do support you and want what's best for you. So I was fortunate to have an amazing teacher in Miss Brenda Martin, who was my special education teacher for the time that I was in elementary school with the IEP. And she always treated me like a star. And then, of course, my mom, who I talked about in that same intro, she played a major role and always advocated for me. Anytime she showed up to IEP meetings, she was the one who, really pushed for the teachers to try out the different interventions that were working at home with me and to apply it in the classroom setting. And thankfully for me, I had teachers at that time who were very humble, very open to receiving the input from parents. And that's not something that's unfortunately as commonplace now. But at the time when I was going through, my trauma and some of the things I went through, I was fortunate to have that. But in terms of how that impacted me, fast forwarding to almost 30 years later, when I decided I want to be an educator, I was able to go back to those times where, I was teased for being as darker than everybody else. I remember having folks take the Hershey chocolate milk carton and put it next to my face to compare which is darker. So
Hmm.
dealing with the colorism, dealing with the racism, the ableism, because when you are in a learning support room with other students with moderate to severe disabilities, that stigma stays with you. It's very obvious that you are a part of that group because you don't ride the same yellow school bus. You ride the
Hmm.
shorter van that drops you off in your house. And it's like, it's the biggest, it's like the elephant in the room. Like you have to talk
Hmm.
about it. And that's what kids did at that time. They see that, they tease you. So dealing with that, and then knowing that I was going to be teaching students who had been through similar tribulations as I did, I mean, it just prepared me to be in that inclusive setting where I'll be dealing with students who had different intellectual disabilities, but also, they're dealing with the same internalized trauma that I dealt with as a Black child. So,
When you are young and you're going through that in the moment, what is it that adults don't know about how you're processing?
like, they're not able to see it because it's internalized. So, how can they
Hmm.
possibly know that there's something going on because we keep it inside? We don't feel like we could trust the adults around us to do anything to rectify what's going on. So we find ways to cope with it. We try to figure out strategies for how to navigate the spaces we're in so we can at least get to the end of the school day. And more times than not, they end up being counterproductive. But I would say a lot of what was happening, I didn't really communicate that to my parents, nor did I communicate it to teachers. It was only those times where, you know, it was obvious that there was teasing going on, like those
Hmm.
external instances that teachers could see that were clearly visible. That's when they were able to intervene and try to support me. But more times than not, it was all in here. It was all
Hmm.
psychological. And when it's going on in your head, no one can get into it. No one can read your mind. So
Hmm.
I didn't really give much of an opportunity to intervene and help me in that regard.
How'd you stop from becoming bitter?
I think as I got older, I realized that the many thoughts and biases that kids have are the result of being in an environment that's informed by a culture of whiteness. So, I mean, as soon as we are born, the default is this culture, just the traditions, the actions, the different standards of living are all
Hmm.
ingrained within white dominant culture. So, being Black and brown children within that culture, we inherit in many cases different anti-Black thoughts.
Hmm.
And as a result, you see people who look like me teasing me. Most of the people who are teasing me look just like me. It wasn't
Really?
even white folks for
Hmm.
them. It
Hmm.
wasn't really white folks. It was really people who looked like me. The ones who were saying the Africa jokes and saying, why do you have this name? Why is your name so different and look so weird? You know what I mean? Like that's where that came from for the most part.
It's funny you say that. I remember the 1970s, that was an insult.
Yeah,
Like you had families that were on different sides of the plot. Like with my father, there was kind of like a more of a pan Africanist understanding of the civil rights movement here. Like, so it felt like it was all part of the same thing. But also at school on the playground, there was really like it was an insult to be connected to African things, right? I can remember people using that as a slur almost, and it was really confusing to me because it was
yeah,
different than what I was learning at home, right? So it just
yeah.
feels like that was in the culture. You say so much of who I am as a teacher and a father is a direct response to the trauma I've experienced throughout my life and in school and at home. I want to talk just quickly about the father part. Like the first day that you become a father and you have that baby in your hand and you're thinking to yourself, wow, what's my philosophy on what I'm going to do here? Like, how did you come up with your philosophy of what type of father you were going to be? What did you carry over from your life that you maybe needed to work through? Because I feel like anybody listening to this right now, if they're becoming a father soon, they're going to encounter some uncertainty about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. So, how did you uh, develop your identity as a father and your philosophy?
I think the basic answer to that is do the opposite of what my father did. Um,
That's a lot of
um,
people's job.
but my father,
Yeah.
just to unpack that a little bit, my father, he was somebody who was verbally abusive, even at times physically abusive towards myself and even some of my siblings growing up. He wasn't the type of person who you can go to just have conversations. There was so much fear that I had. I could even come up to him just to ask him for things or to talk because I was afraid that he was going to get upset. So
Hmm.
there was that fear that was there, and unfortunately, we missed out on those father son moments that a lot of men and young men typically have. I didn't get those moments. I didn't get a chance to have him be the one to teach me how to drive or to have that first beer with him or to learn how to fix a car and to, get my hands dirty and doing that manual work. Like I didn't have those typical moments. A lot of those came with my older brother, who really helped to show me an example of what it means to be a father because he was the first in our family to get married. He was the first in our family to have children. So just being able to watch him and having him serve as a blueprint for what it meant to be not only a great father, but also what it means to be a committed partner in marriage. I learned a
Hmm.
lot of that
Hmm.
from watching him interact with my sister-in-law and my nieces. So that was, my blueprint. But as far as my father's concerned, I just wanted to be a different father to my kids. I didn't want to be the abusive type. I wanted to be somebody who is emotionally intelligent, who is empathetic, and is someone that, my kids can come to for any advice and can approach me with anything. But I also recognize that because I am my daddy's child, there are certain parts of him that are within me that are just
Hmm.
unavoidable. And I have a responsibility to make sure that when those parts of me come out, whether it's in my parenting or in my interaction with my wife, I need to make sure that I check myself so that I don't go down the same toxic path that my father did. So just to kind of give some context for my parenting.
Sounds like part of it you had to invent your own style, but part of it you had two experiences that helped. One, an older brother that was a model.
That's
And
right.
then two, I imagine being an uncle before you're a father gives you some practice run a little bit, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And it does help that I was a teacher as well because I'm around kids all the time. So just
Hmm.
having that in my back pocket helped tremendously.
There's a section in here that I think is at the heart of something that I'm always thinking about. And you talk about combating anti-blackness in schools.
Yes,
And you talk about, anti-blackness within the education system and the importance of counter narratives, which is something I'm always about. I believe storytelling makes a difference. I think counter narratives that, that kind of go after a dominant narrative that's negative is important. You talk about some very specific archetypes, though, like the black brute, the
hmm,
hypersexualization of girls,
yeah.
adultification. I'm interested in this. So tell me about this part, how all of that plays. Well, first of all, let me start somewhere else because there's one quote I got to start with. Socially conscious artists such as Ras Kass, KRS-One, Yaslin Bey, and Talib Kweli helped me foster a deeper understanding of my own blackness. So that's an outside force that helps you develop positively. Tell me more about that first. I want to start there. Because usually
Yeah.
people think of hip hop as a bad influence, not a socially conscious good experience.
So I'm an 80s baby. So and of course I had my older brother. So I grew up listening to hip hop. I grew up listening to those names that you mentioned, as well as some other folks like a De La Soul,
Mhm.
um, a Tribe Called Quest, which is my
Let's stop
favorite
there for
group.
1 second. Did you
Yeah.
understand what De La Soul was saying?
As a kid, definitely
Yeah.
not, but you was jamming to the vibes. Now, as an adult, I totally get what it's saying now, but as a kid, you have to understand, I was 6 or 7 years old
Oh man,
when
no,
3 Feet
no,
High
no.
and
Okay.
Rising came out. So all the innuendos and the metaphors and just the
Yeah.
figurative language was way over my head, but you still could nod your head because of the rhythm and the beat. So there was a spirit there.
This is such a good point, though, in that you just mentioned like it's literature almost. There were
Yeah.
analogies and there metaphors. There was all kinds. So it made you smarter to listen to it. Again, we don't talk about this with hip hop as the positive. So I don't actually enough because I remember more socially conscious hip hop. I don't see as much of it now. So I didn't mean to go off track. So these were part of your identity formation. These artists were helpful to you. So I think you were telling us about how that was helpful to you.
So having a brother that listened to hip hop all the time, and we came from Connecticut. So in Connecticut, we listen to everybody. We listen to, cats in New York. We listen to people down south, Atlanta, Houston, uh, obviously the West Coast, with Death Row, Snoop, Dre, all those guys. So we pretty much listened to everybody that sounded good at that time. And as I got older, you start listening to people like a Dead Prez, like a Yasin Bey, listening to Back on Both Sides and so many other albums that really speak to the critical consciousness, of hip hop, but also they counteract a lot of the anti-black messaging that we do find in hip hop culture through the music. So being around that really helped to show me the other side of blackness. It
Hmm.
really helped
Hmm.
me to see that, hey, like there's some history there that I'm not learning in school, but Karis was teaching me this. Razcast is teaching me this. Um, Talib Kweli is teaching me this. Tribe Called Quest is teaching me this. These are people who are part of the soundtrack to my childhood. And they're the ones
Hmm.
who are feeding me these messages way before I was an African American studies minor at Temple University. I was learning some of these lessons during my K to 12 just through the music, not in the textbooks at school. And just to put the icing on the cake, I had to lean into that music because during my high school years, I was in a predominantly white high school where there was 500 students, and out of the 500, maybe 15 to 20 of them are black. So
I mean, that's like that creates a need for a cultural connection outside of where you live.
yeah,
So, what's interesting about those artists, and now as I remember it, you jogged my memory on some things. I remember getting teaching from them in a way that I didn't know that it was like the KRS-One stuff. I mean, he actually calls himself the professor. He actually goes
yes.
through actual lessons in his work. So that gave me at that age some positive stereotyping. It wasn't about disco and dancing and, kind of like the stereotypical lifestyle. It gave me smart people who like prided themselves on being educated as a stereotype. But you talk about the flip side of that. What is the deal with like the black brute, the angry black woman, the hypersexualization the adultification? These are all impactful negative stereotypes. And what's your learning on those stereotypes?
Well, I mean, growing up, you think about the black brute, you think about the fact that, a lot of brothers, they were into athletics. Whenever you saw a successful brother growing up, more times than not, it was either a professional athlete or an entertainer, whether it be a
Hmm.
rap artist, R&B singer. Those were the two main people who we saw as heroes in our community. Now, of course, there are doctors and there are community activists and others, but they're not the ones who come to mind when you first think about heroes. So when I think about the black brute, obviously it's the image that, black men are scary, they're intimidating, they're going to harm white women and all this. Like those that imagery and that messaging, those are things that translate to being in a place where there aren't too many black folk, a place where white folks are not used to seeing black folks in their town. So there's that, but then the hypersexualization, I mean, we could talk all day about the misogyny that's not just within hip hop, but just other parts of black culture. You think about some of the sitcoms that we grew up watching. I mean, there's a certain amount of misogyny in some of our favorite sitcoms, but we kind of just overlook it because it's culture. You know what I mean? Like
And it's
we're not as
played for laughs. It's played for
and
laughs.
it's played for laughs. It's like it's satire. It's comical. But those are but that's messaging that still exists. You think about the Jezebel stereotype. A lot of our favorite black sitcoms, you had at least one Jezebel character, that was a part of that. So I think with a lot of the black stereotypes, they're totally immersed within black popular culture.
That's a teacher. In itself, that's a teacher. Like when you think
Yeah.
about things that teach you lessons in life,
Yeah.
you have a family as a teacher, you have school and teachers as a teacher, and you have culture as a teacher.
That's right.
And if your culture is like your culture was to live quilly, but if your culture is Sanford and Son, which was my culture, that's before your time.
Eleanor,
Yep.
I'm coming, Eleanor.
You know what's so funny is Sharif El-Mekki, who you know and who I know.
Yep.
Him and I were talking about Sanford and Son, and he didn't really remember much of it because I think he was out of the country when it was in its heyday or something.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I was telling him, I was like, they still use the N-word on Sanford and Son. That was a time
They
when
sure
you could just
do.
use it freely. And he was like, no. Now, I just sent him a clip.
A Red Fox, right?
Yeah, Red Fox, yes.
Yep.
On primetime TV, and he
Yes.
just couldn't believe it. I was like, yeah, man, a lot has changed. You can't do that anymore. You would think it would have been worse than it actually was, but that's a teacher. I learned from culture a lot, especially when I retreated into myself and I wasn't interested in school. Culture became kind of my other teacher, and some of it was positive, some of it wasn't. Even Richard Pryor and things like that. There was an upside to Richard Pryor in that he did social commentary. He buried social commentary in the downside of his work, which was a lot of kind of like, kind of language. You wouldn't remember this, but you had to sneak in your parents' room and get the album,
Yes.
Richard Pryor album, and put it on while they weren't around in life. I got another question for you too, because you did a good job going beyond the Black experience, but to kind of be a well-rounded educator. So you talked more about the Native American, Asian, and Latino experiences, and they all had their own unique way for you to look at them and their cause, or not their cause, but their learning identity. You did some exploration of them. What's the through line between all of them and ours? What's the thing that you think kind of is the same across all of those different groups?
They all impacted by white supremacist culture. I mean, that's the through line. And they in their own unique way. If we're talking about indigenous and native tribal communities, we could talk about the boarding schools era. We could talk about the fact that it was a time where you had young, native people being removed from their reservations and they're attending school where they have to be stripped of their culture, stripped of their language, and all aspects of their indigenous identity. So it's so funny how we hear this word indoctrination being used when we're trying to promote culturally and identity affirming curriculum material. But then you look at the boarding schools era, which was a total antithesis of that, and you don't get that same commentary. So that's just an example of just how white supremacist culture played its role in disrupting the indigeneity of those communities. And then you look at Asian American Pacific Islander communities, but specifically the Asian American community. We could talk about minority myth. We could talk about Asian Americans being perpetual foreigners, or even the fact that whenever we talk about Asian Americans, we think that they should all phenotypically look like East Asians, whether they're Chinese, whether they are Japanese, whether they are Korean. But there's
Mm-hmm.
such a diverse range of folks within the Asian continent and beyond that we need to touch on. So, and I could go on, but looking at all the different communities that I spoke about in the first half of the book, the through line is the fact that they were all impacted by white supremacist culture. There's a reason why when we first opened the book, the very first chapter is about how we disrupt and examine the culture of whiteness in our schools and beyond. That has to be the starting point, because if you are a white educator who's picking this book up, I'm going to assume that you already believe and acknowledge the fact that racism is endemic within our global society. So yes, I'm throwing some critical race talk, but racism is
Yeah, I mean,
endemic.
I saw you going there, and I was about to say, they're outlawing this in school right now, and next year it might even get worse
Hey,
with the outlawing of it. I don't know if you've heard, but it's very possible that they will take Title I money away from schools that teach in this direction. Did you know that you were being a transgressor as you were writing this?
I was very much aware of that. I was very much aware that, you know what, the red states ain't gonna love me, but oh well. I'm not writing this book
Yeah.
for them. I'm writing
Yeah.
the book for the folks who are already aligned with me or have a vested interest in wanting to engage in this liberatory work. Those are the people who I write for. See, my thing, Chris, is this. When we're doing this work, we got to protect our peace. We've seen so many of our ancestors fall victim to racial battle fatigue because, you know, they fighting, and they end up dying young or being assassinated.
Mhm.
So just for my own sanity, I'm not going to invest my energy trying to argue with folks who don't agree with me or don't align with me. Now, for those who do it, like Dr. Mark Lamont Hill and others, they're good at that. That's not my lane. That's their lane, and I appreciate them for doing that, because we need people like that within the movement. But then at the same time, I know that my lane is telling stories and disseminating stories that speak to the authenticity of who people are. That's where I shine. And that's my role within this movement. And because I'm very much aware of that, I just focus on doing that and then allowing others to be great in their lanes.
You mentioned Dr. Lamont Hill, who
Yeah.
has he's had a price to pay, and so have a lot of rank and file
Yeah.
Black teachers. And
Yeah.
this week I'm going to be at the event. There's going to be a room full of Black male teachers. I think one of the things that they all have to be a little bit concerned about is if you step out there too much, there's a price to pay. Oftentimes, in your career, in your situation. So you write this book, you put it out into the world. What would you say to the people that are going to be receptive to this message and read it, but they're isolated in places where they know that they would, they'd catch some sort of case for doing the right thing?
For those who are in that predicament, I would just tell them that, number one, you're going to have to be strategic in how you go about doing this work,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
because of the amount of censorship and red tape that's within your state, your county, your district. You're going to have to take a different approach. Now, obviously, a lot of legislation that's out there is targeting teachers. Now, if you have parents who believe in what you believe in, you got to lean on those stakeholders.
Mm-hmm,
Let the
mm-hmm,
parents be the mouthpiece for what you
mm-hmm.
want to say in the classroom. Because guess what? The worst thing that can happen to a school district is bad press. They don't want to be on the news for the wrong reasons. So if you're able to mobilize a group of parents who really want this identity affirming work and education to happen within the school, then you got to let them know what the challenges are for you as a teacher and let them know that, hey, this is what we need y'all to be at those school board meetings. We need y'all to go to the city council meetings and to just get your voice out there. And we can help you in terms of mobilizing so that you're able to do that. But there's also organizations that are already mobilizing and doing the work. Perfect example, shout out to Carrie Rodriguez and the National Parents
Parents
Union
Union.
and
Yeah.
all the work they're doing. I just saw Carrie a few days ago. I'm here in Chicago at the SEL exchange for Castle, and Carrie was there and we were able to connect. But she's somebody who I lean on, given that we both are in Massachusetts and we've seen some of the same issues within our schools out in the Commonwealth. She is somebody who has shown what it means to be a parent advocate, but also what it means to mobilize other parents who may not be as knowledgeable about what's going on within our schools. So you have pockets of communities like that within our country, and there's other people too that we can lean on. The students, let them be the mouthpiece, because guess what? We do this work because of them. And if they're the ones who are mobilizing, if they're the ones who are picketing and they're organizing and speaking out about what's going on, then guess what? The principals and the high officials within the district have to listen, because it's the kids talking. You're not going to dismiss a child. You're not going to be as quick to dismiss a child as you would a teacher or faculty member.
You would hope not. I
You
mean,
would hope not.
you
You
would
would
hope
hope not.
not. I don't put it past any of them, but I think it's a good example. I've talked a lot about what teachers were like, especially African American teachers were like before 1954. And they were teaching the community. As they were teaching the kids, they were teaching the community the needs of their children. They were kind of doing what you said, telling them what to advocate for. They were like professional advisors to the community. They didn't see themselves as just a classroom teacher. They saw themselves as kind of like an instrument of God's will, right? Tell the parents what you need so they can advocate from the outside. And then that way you're safe within your inside position and they're doing their job from the outside. And now you have a real movement. You have a real kind of revelatory thing. You round all of this out into rethinking curriculum, to rethinking about how we should structurally think about curriculum. You have something here that I think is good for everybody here, because it's about how you're supposed to look at history, but the general public doesn't really think about it this way. So for every period of time that you're teaching, you should always be constructively thinking, what were Black people doing? What were Hispanic people doing? What were Indigenous people doing? What were women doing? This is such a good, maxim. This is such a good way of thinking about how you teach or think about history, because some people want to take those questions off the table.
Mm-hmm.
They want to study historic periods and not answer those questions you just asked. So when you think about things like Make America Great Again, right? And somebody has to ask, well, when was that exactly? Because I want to ask the question, what were Black people doing during that era when things were so great? How do you propose this shows up in curriculum? What do you think we should do about it to make sure that the curriculum answers these questions well? And what's your policy prescription here?
So shout out to Ernest Krim for that quote. Ernest Quim. If you don't know Ernest, make sure y'all follow him on social media. He does an excellent job amplifying the importance of Black history within our schools and beyond. So he's somebody who people need to follow. But to answer your question, I would say the key is for us to get our students to be critical thinkers and for them to come to their own perspectives on what's going on around them. This is what Paulo Freire talks about in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This is what Bell Hooks talks about in her books, like the importance of critical thinking and how that's a tool for liberation. If we're not asking students, or if we're presenting this information, because we know that with every news source, there's an agenda that's attached to it, whether it's right leaning or left leaning. So guess what? Present present them all. Don't just present one side of it, present them all. And even those that are in between, pose the questions that Ernest is talking about and allow for students to come to their own conclusions about it. That's how you build criticality and agency within students. And it's those very skills that's going to allow them to see the BS that's happening around us sociopolitically. Now, it's not indoctrination if we're just posing the question and they come to their own conclusions about it. That is what I call agency building. And that should be something that we should promote within our curriculum, whether it's in the humanities, whether it's in science, math, any subject area. We should be putting students in position to strengthen that muscle so that they can interrogate what's going on within their communities and beyond.
I think there is so much work to be done when it comes to making the curriculum right, to making the schools right, making the classrooms right. Do you ever lose hope? Do you ever lose hope on the fact that it can even be done because there's such a level of difficulty, so many different layers to the problem? The curriculum could be wrong. The teaching could be wrong. The school setup could be wrong. The leadership in the school could be wrong. The district could be, like you said earlier, we have districts where Black children are like the extreme exception. Do you ever lose hope that like anything can fix all this? I mean, it seems like a pretty big job.
It's always been a big job. Historically, it's been a big job, but it hasn't stopped our ancestors from doing it. You know,
they still had to move on.
They still had to move on. Like, even though it was hard, and we can't allow for indifference to creep into our souls. We can't allow for it to creep into our souls. And sometimes that could be difficult to do because time and time again, we get disappointed. You know, perfect example, these past elections and those results. I mean, the realists will probably say, I kind of saw it coming because, you know, the U.S., they're not ready for a Black woman to take the throne in the Oval Office. That's just the reality. If Hillary wasn't able to do it 8 years ago, you know, Kamala probably wasn't going to be able to do it. And I voted for her. I was hoping for it, you know what I mean? But that's something that's the reality. But here's what it comes down to, Chris. We know that regardless of whether it was a Democrat or a Republican sitting in that seat, it's not the person that we're trying to get rid of. The person that's sitting in that seat right now is a beneficiary of a system that's been designed to continue to put us in an inferior position. He's a beneficiary of it. So even if you get rid of him and you put a Democrat in there, the system is still what it is. So the way I look at it, the mission doesn't change for me. It's still the same mission, whether it was going to be Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. It's going to be the same mission. It does not change at all. So as far as my perspective on it, my focus is always going to be on the students. And what gives me hope is the fact that I believe students, our Gen Z students, are more aware of what's happening. They're a lot more, I'm not a lot more, but they're very socially conscious. They're bold. They're radical in how they disseminate information and also call people out on it. I've seen way too many examples of teenagers speaking out and eloquently speaking about the issues that are going on. And you have young entrepreneurs who are already civically engaged within their communities.
You know, I'll push back on one piece of that, though. One thing I would push back on with this one that has surprised me of late. I thought for sure that the next generation is going to be one of the most progressive ever. They're going to be one of the ones that ask the most questions and you know, not just take things for granted because somebody in authority said it to you, right?
Right.
I wasn't ready for the fact that many of them also are going to get captured in the culture of right-wing stuff too, though. Like there's going to be a percentage of them that see some power in being part of the right-wing juggernaut, that kind of anti-black stuff, that wear your flags on your colors or on your shoulders type of thing. I was not ready for that actually as being one of the areas of that they would engage in, and it appears like that might be happening.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I didn't really see that coming either.
Me either. I mean, it's surprising to me. That used to be uncool. It used to be uncool to be on that side of the fence. And I think what some people have done is they've made it culturally not just acceptable, but it could become your identity. Like we're offering you identity. And people love to belong. They love to belong to something. So when you put that hat on, you're belonging. When you put that shirt on, you're belonging. It's your tribe all of a sudden. And I think that's going to be appealing to some young people. I wanted to come back to one last thing around
Yep.
parents specifically. I had some notes here. So a significant portion of Black parents believe that schools are not adequately trying to educate their children. And I remember this coming out in a study years ago. It was like Black parents don't even think schools are trying to educate their children, often citing a perception of lower expectations, inadequate curriculum regarding Black history and culture, and a lack of support for Black students, leading to a feeling that the system is not designed to help their children succeed. What would you say to parents that are thinking that and hold that as an opinion about how they have to do two things at once? They have to challenge the schools to do better, and at the same time, they still have a duty, like we all do, to make sure our kids learn, right? So, we got to fight the system as we're actually trying to use the system to get the thing our kids need. What would you say to parents about balancing that out, especially if they're civilians? They don't think about this every day. This is not their forte.
I mean, you got to come in knowing that, listen, not every school's perfect. Not every district is perfect. There is going to be gaps that show up. Now, the question is, in a situation where you notice these gaps, are you going to wait for the district or the teachers or school to fill those gaps? Or are you going to find ways to supplement?
Hmm.
And from what I've seen, you have parents who go the latter route. They find ways to supplement for what's lacking within their children's schools. So whether it's after school programming, whether it's some online programming that is educational, but also is pro-Black, is speaking to the history and the counter stories of our movements. And there's a lot more that's happening there. I just think homeschooling, yes, it's an option, but logistically, it could be a challenge depending on where you are, right?
Hmm.
Because you may not be in a part of the country or the world where you have that access to homeschools or
Hmm.
those options. Even if they're virtual, what if you're in a space where you don't really have that type of access to technology to access that type of enrichment or learning? But I think, especially now, given what's happening post pandemic, post George Floyd, even though this is way before George Floyd, I mean, people are now just coming late into the party. I think we need to, number one, reevaluate the schools that we bring our kids into. And also understand that, hey, okay, I see y'all not giving this to my child. I got to do a little bit more. I got to do a little bit more. And it might cost me a little bit more money, which is going to be tough because when you're looking for those type of programs to supplement with, that's going to cost you some money. And not every family has that kind of money.
At the same time, though, I don't think many of us as parents have not, from the beginning, thought of it as like an expense that we should be making all the time. I know richer people do, middle class people do, some people in the working class do. I mean, they
Yeah,
sacrifice to get their kid into like that parochial school or something, and it makes them work
sure.
a second job. But every family should have some budget for the learning of their children as just a normal course of doing life because of what you said. We're part of one group of people that have to have compensatory education because we're going to have to compensate for the education that our kids aren't going to get.
Right.
Not just like aren't getting. It's not going to happen in our lifetime, probably for some schools. That your kid has a deep and a deep knowledge of history and world history and Pan-Africanist history, there's some things you can almost be certain that they're not going to get at school, which means you need to have a library at home. You need
Yeah.
to have the books around. You don't have to push them on the kids, though. That's one thing I've learned does
No.
not work. Say you must read, but having it in the house, I think, helps it. Helps them.
I agree with everything you're saying. And just to add to what you're saying, Chris, we have to remember these systems that our children are in educationally were never designed for us in the first place. So therefore, by default, we should be supplementing in some shape or form. We should be supplementing. That should be our default. Knowing the premise that we know about schools in America and the history of school in America, we got to do a little bit more as parents.
As we close out, you wrote this book. You put blood, sweat, and tears and time into writing a book, which I think is an amazing accomplishment for anybody. So congratulations on that, for one.
Thank you.
What's the one thing you want to make sure that people take away from the book? What would you say if they get this out of the book, it means that I did my job?
Oh, thank you for asking this question. So just to let you know, as you can see, I'm a Black man. I'm a cisgender heterosexual Black man. And if I can't be the spokesperson within my own community, I sure in hell can't be the spokesperson for all these other communities I talk about. That's number one. So just to let people know, this book, look at it as a primer. This is a foundational resource. If you are somebody who is still getting their feet wet in terms of equity work, in terms of learning about different identities, this is kind of an intro book. And then at the end of each chapter, you have extended resources for learning. So there are podcasts, there are documentaries to watch, there's other literature for you to read. So I would just tell people, this, just because you read this book from start to finish doesn't mean that you're an expert. The learning has to continue beyond it. And just to let people know, I'm hoping that more people add to the scholarship. I was only able to write this book because the ancestors wrote books before me. The Frantz Fanons of the world, the Amos Wilsons of the world, the Bell Hooks, the Audre Lordes of the world. I'm even going to throw in my OG, Principal Baruti Kafeles of the world. They wrote the books. So I was the beneficiary of all this cultural knowledge. So now, as an educator, it's my responsibility to extend that scholarship. And I do that by writing these books. And for some people, it may be just a blog. It may be a vlog. It may be some other medium of content that you share so that folks are more aware of the scholarship. But I think that's going to have to be our responsibility collectively, because we know that the censorship is already happening. We've already seen Project 2025 and what it's going to do when it's enacted. We already know there are executive orders that are going to be enacted once Donald Trump gets into office in January. These are things that we know already. So the way I look at it is basic math. There are a lot more of us who are committed to doing this equity work than there are elected officials who are trying to censor it. It's a numbers game. So if we collectively can continue to push this scholarship and communicate these messages similar to the ones in here, they can't censor it all. They can't censor it all. And guess what? Going back to our stakeholders, going back to our parents, going back to our communities, they may not be the ones who are in the schools, but guess what? They can bring those books to their homes. So at least their kids can have access to that.
And that's my thing about making sure that it's just in the house, because even if you don't make them read it or whatever, I think kids, when they have access to things in their house, they find it on their own. There's times where they get bored. That's kind of been one of my parental strategies, is just make sure my house is stocked with creative tools and reading, and then watch what happens. right? Because kids get bored sometimes and they just go grab, anything to stop
Yeah.
their boredom. And sometimes it's a camera, sometimes
Yes.
it's a microphone. I mean, I have podcasting equipment, didn't do anything to make it happen. One of my sons came home and he had done 2 or 3 podcasts with friends. That's just because the stuff was in the house. It wasn't because I'd said anything about it. It was just there. And you get bored enough, you start doing it. Same thing with cameras and then books. Like, we have a room full of books. I don't think they're going to read the majority of them books. It would be my dream that they would, and that I would have these super studious kids that would know everything about history. But no, just having it there. And on that note, I will say this to people listening and watching. One revolutionary act that you can do is that when you see authors, especially authors that are either marginalized by race, class, geography, whatever. If we want an inclusive world, means we have to have access to inclusive materials. So I believe in libraries. I love libraries. Make sure your local library requests the books that we talk about on this show. So one, end thing I would say at the end of this show, Learning to Relearn, Supporting Identity in a Culturally Affirming Classroom by Kwame Sarfo-Mensah is a book that you want to make sure that you go to your library. If they don't have it, you put in one of those requests. Exactly. This is one thing. I don't ask you guys for much. I don't ask you to do much. I'm not asking you to, be Harriet Tubman and walk through fields and, do overnight kind of journeys. I'm just asking you to make sure that your library is stocked with these books. And the way that it happens is when you request it, they buy it. If you're a student and you're listening to this, make sure that your college library has this. Put in a request. Do this for me, do it for us, and do it for everybody. And then if you're not a college student, if you local library near your house, put in a request form. So they stock it, hopefully multiple copies. And then the other thing that I can say, teachers and teachers collaborators, teacher circles and groups, buy the book and do book clubs. This is number one. This is how we repay people spending times and years putting stuff into books and putting blood, sweat, and tears in. That's our repayment for it. Buy a copy. Buy more than one copy if you can. Give it as a gift. Make sure the libraries have it. And those of you who are teachers or educators, buy it and then do study circles around it. Also, get in touch with me because I could get you in touch with the author. I got the hookup. So if y'all want the author to join your book club, see, now I can't speak for him. I'm about to put the brother out there and make everybody start calling you directly.
Yeah. It's
But
already
I have,
started, man.
listen, there was a time in my life where I never thought I would know people that actually wrote the books. So having access to people now where I could say, I know the dude, if you want me to connect you, I can connect you, makes me feel like I've done something right in life. So thank you for writing this book and putting your time, your effort, and your soul into it. I appreciate you, man.
Yeah, but thank you, Chris, for helping to set the foundation. Like what y'all do at Brightbeam through education posts, that really helped to strengthen that muscle. Like I can't stress that enough. And I believe there are more educators who want to write this type of content. Link in, lock in with Ed Post and other organizations that are all about liberatory education, and they walk the talk.
I
So
appreciate
I
that.
appreciate you.
So people listening to that, you heard that. If you want to start writing on your journey and on your way to writing a book, contact us at EdPost. We'll definitely be able to lend our support, amplify your work, and help amplify you so that you get to this point where your book is coming out. It's on Amazon, Amazon Prime. It's about to be Black Friday. There's stuff you need to give. Some of y'all going to give dumb gifts. So why not add one smart gift to the dumb gifts?
Yes.
And make it happen. Support the cause. Well, thank you all for listening and watching. This has been another episode of Always Learning. Today we've been with Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. His book is Learning to Relearn, and you can pick it up on Amazon, as I said, or you can find it at independent booksellers, which I also support and think you should try. We'll see you next time on Always Learning.